Good morning, and welcome to the OPC's Sea Level Rise Policy webinar. I'm Mary Small. I'm the Deputy Director of the Coastal Conservancy, and we are hosting this as part of the California Coastal Resilience Network and in partnership with OPC. I'll just do a couple of housekeeping things. First of all, if you have questions during the webinar, please type them in because you're muted. So you need to type them in, and if you don't see where to type them, you have to click the orange arrow and it says where to type in questions. And secondly, we are recording this, so we'll post a link to the recorded webinar to everyone who had registered, and if any of your colleagues missed it, they can watch it online at their leisure. So with that, I will pass it over to Deborah Halverstadt, the Director of the Ocean Protection Council.
Thanks, Mary, and thank all of you who are participating. There are actually over 200 of you, and we are so pleased to be able to provide this opportunity to discuss our draft sea level rise guidance document with you. As you know, over the past year, OPC has been working on this guidance, and we appreciate all of the comments, edits, and assistance we've received from our partners at the state and local levels, in academia, in the nonprofit community. And I mean, as you all know, the impacts of sea level rise are significant. The vast majority of California's population lives in coastal counties and will directly experience the effects of sea level rise on their homes, their roads, their public services, their infrastructure. We need to establish a coordinated response and provide clear guidance about how to plan for and prepare for sea level rise. California, as a state, has already exhibited strong global leadership in terms of both climate adaptation and mitigation, and this guidance document really seeks to build on that leadership by providing a bold and scientifically founded methodology for state and local governments to analyze and assess the risks associated with sea level rise. In this webinar, we will be highlighting the themes running through the public comments we received and explaining how we have responded to and integrated those comments. We will also discuss next steps because our work on sea level rise definitely does not end with the publication of a guidance. We really welcome and seek your input on how, moving forward, this document can be implemented and taken up by state agencies, local governments, local communities. So thank you again for your participation today, and thank you again to Coastal Conservancy and the Coastal Resilience Network. And I will now turn the conversation over to Jen Eckerly, our Deputy Director at OPC.
Thanks, Deborah. Again, this is Jen Eckerly. I'm the Deputy Director at the Ocean Protection Council, and I just want to echo Deborah's thanks for everyone's participation and joining us today. In addition to myself and Deborah on the call, I just want to acknowledge that in addition to Deborah's leadership on this issue, Jen Phillips, who's our climate change policy lead and has been doing much of that heavy lift to help us with this update, is also on the line and available to answer questions. And I wanted to give a quick thank you to Sarah Briley, who's one of our Sea Grant Fellows, who has also been providing much needed help to get us where we are today. So as Deborah mentioned, the presentation today is really going to cover why we're doing this guidance document update, what our process has been to do the update, key themes from the public comments, how we are integrating those comments, and a quick high-level summary of those revisions, next steps as far as when that draft will become, the final draft will become public, and when it will be heard for adoption by the Ocean Protection Council. And then, again, we really want to provide an opportunity at the end of this webinar not only to solicit comments from you, but really to ask questions about what is needed to ensure successful implementation of this guidance at both the state and local level. So with that, I will move on to the meat of the presentation. So first, I just wanted to highlight what initiated or triggered the update to the sea level rise guidance. And there were really two reasons for updating. First was significant advances in sea level rise science, particularly our understanding of ice loss from the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets and the implication for that loss on California's coast, to ensure that California's planning decisions were based on the best available science. And this was really catalyzed by direction from Governor Brown. Additionally, There was an increased policy focus requiring both state and local governments to incorporate climate change into decision-making, and that includes Governor Brown's Executive Order B3015. And so now we have a need to update the guidance to address both the needs of state and local governments. And I think, as most of you on the call know, we have been working on this update process for over a year, and we had three main steps. We had first, a synthesis of the best available science that was outlined in the Rising Seas report presented to the Ocean Protection Council in April of last year. And this report included advances in modeling and improved understanding of extreme sea level rise loss from the polar ice sheets, a shift to probabilistic projections, and an extreme H++ scenario that reflects the potential sea level rise as a result of ice loss from the West Antarctic ice sheet. And the second part of this process was an extensive public outreach and stakeholder engagement to solicit input from local, regional, state, and federal stakeholders and tribes. This outreach included interviews, listening sessions, and public workshops, in addition to close coordination with state coastal management agencies and other member agencies of the state's Coastal and Ocean Working Group of the Climate Action Team. And then finally, we integrated the best available science along with the user needs that we received from all of our public outreach to update the policy guidance itself, the draft of which was released for 30-day public review and comment on November 15th of 2017. So just to go over some key themes from the public comments we received about 25 comment letters from state agencies, local governments, including both cities and counties, and folks working both in planning and utility agencies, community groups, tribal representatives, nonprofits, ports, scientists, and engineers. And the themes really covered what you're seeing here on the screen. We were asked to provide better descriptions and explanation of probabilistic projections, to strengthen the social equity recommendation, to recognize the diversity of shoreline characteristics along California's coast, to describe how this guidance fits into the broader state and regulatory and policy framework, to think more about integrating the concept of adaptation pathways and making sure that adaptation strategies also include the development of contingency plans. We got a range of feedback on the H++ scenario from people being very appreciative of the inclusion of that, and also people voicing concern that we need to have more information about this before we really integrate it into planning. We received some comments about strengthening the managed retreat recommendation and improving justification for recommended risk aversion projections. A high-level summary of the revisions that you will see in the final document include an increased emphasis on the use of adaptation pathways, and this includes bolstering the section that we had included on the use of triggers and thresholds, and ensuring that we can have a precautionary yet flexible approach to sea level rise planning and adaptation. We also improved the discussion on probabilistic projections and the explanation of the difference between probabilistic projections, which are Bayesian probabilities and are based on an assessment of the strength of observational and modeling and theoretical multiple lines of evidence, as compared to frequentist probabilities, which are probabilities of recurring events such as coastal floods that are based on historic frequency of occurrence. So we improved the discussion of those differences in the updated guidance. We also included an explanation of guidance implementation, so new language clarifying how the projections and the recommendations will be incorporated into state agency decisions and how it will be integrated into local government planning and adaptation efforts through a range of statutory, regulatory, and policy mechanisms, such as the Coastal Commission's Local Coastal Program and the General Plan updates. We also strengthened recommendations for planning and adaptation, which included new or improved language addressing social equity and environmental justice. So we provided greater emphasis on the importance of early engagement with vulnerable communities, and we strengthened the adaptation strategies to address impacts from sea level rise and toxic sites, the importance of protecting access to and along the beach, preventing displacement by protecting local jobs and housing as we start thinking about transitioning to more natural infrastructure or managed retreat, thinking about the economic impacts of agriculture from saltwater intrusion, and the need to improve emergency service response if and when we have a significant disaster flooding event. We also strengthened the language around managed retreat, acknowledged that managed retreat is not something that is potentially an appropriate strategy across the entire coast, but that when it is merited, it can provide benefits not only for the protection of natural resources, but also for personal safety and infrastructure investments. We also included a new recommendation acknowledging the unique characteristics of water-dependent infrastructure, ports, and public trust uses. These uses are often located in densely developed areas where managed retreat or natural infrastructure may not be feasible, and therefore these facilities may need to be protected in place. We included some additional language acknowledging the diversity of shoreline types and natural conditions and community characteristics and land ownership and local priorities, and the fact that these differences may warrant different approaches to planning and adaptation, particularly when thinking about decisions for new development versus maintenance or replacement of existing assets necessary for public health and safety. And then we also just wanted to highlight that we integrated many recommended line edits to strengthen the document throughout, in particular to strengthen its ease of use, its application, and readability. So as far as next steps, the final guidance will be available for public review on March 2nd and will be considered for adoption by the Ocean Protection Council at a special hearing on the 14th from 3 to 5 p.m. in Sacramento. I think, as most of you know, in addition to providing this standalone guidance document, we are partnering with the Governor's Office of Planning and Research to provide a breadth of sea level rise tools, case studies, funding opportunities that will be a partner component to the guidance itself to be sure that folks have the resources necessary to plan and adapt for sea level rise going forward. And then finally, as Deborah noted in her introductory remarks, OPC is committed to continuing to work with state and local entities and other partners to ensure successful implementation of the guidance. And so with that, we can open it up to questions. And again, we really would welcome feedback on the types of actions or efforts that folks see as a critical next step in making sure that this guidance is understandable and used for both state and local agencies. And we did receive some feedback on the initial draft about continuing to improve local and state coordination to maximize alignment and the need for kind of on-the-ground engineering design criteria to translate the probabilistic projections in the guidance to on-the-ground kind of design implementation. And so with that, I will say thank you, and I look forward to the conversation. Hello?
So again, if you have any questions for Jen, please type them into the question box because we can't hear you. We can only see what you type in.
So I'm not seeing anything on my end, Mary, but maybe people are frantically typing.
I know, I'm not seeing any either.
I have stunned everyone into silence. So I see a question about, I think they're coming in. Mary, should I just address these as they come in? Is that the best way?
Yeah, I think that's the best way.
Okay, so, and my guess is you guys can see this because you can see my screen. So one question is, will we release the final draft soon? So the final draft will be released for public review and comment on March 2nd. Question about, can I repeat what I said about engineering design criteria? So one of the comments that we have been receiving throughout this process is the need to really be able to translate this for engineers and planners who are doing the on-the-ground work. And so we've heard that comment loud and clear, and we have been coordinating with our colleagues across the hall at the Resources Agency who are actually have a working group as part of Assembly Bill 2800 to think about kind of infrastructure design needs around planning for climate change and sea level rise. So we have already started connecting those dots, and this is on their list of things that we need help kind of translating from the guidance to real-time implementation.
So Jen, I don't think folks can see the question, so if you can just keep reading them, I think that's great.
Okay, I will. For some reason, they're like in this teeny little thread here, so I'll try. Okay, has there been any update to the sea level rise projections or probabilities since the April 2017 report? So the Rising Seas report provided projections for 3 tide gauges, one in Crescent City, one in San Francisco, and one in San Diego. The guidance document actually takes that one step further and provides those projections for 12 active tide gauges up and down the coast. So that is the difference from what was provided in the science report versus what you'll see in the guidance.
Hey, Jen, this is Deborah. Can I just jump in with one more piece to that? So it looks like, so the question is asking, have there been any updates to the sea level rise projections or probabilities since April 2017? I think it's just important to note that the sea level rise guidance was a synthesis of the best available science at the time. That science is going to continue to evolve as research continues to be done. And one of the things that we are committed to doing at OPC is periodically updating our guidance based on new information that comes in. So we see this as a dynamic process. Sea level rise is not static. It's not going to hold still. It's not going to be committed to one number in one place. And so we want to acknowledge that and recognize that this is a living document that will need to be updated, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to incorporate some of the suggestions like the adaptation pathways that will enable governments to look forward without being committed to a particular single projection.
Thanks, Deborah. So I have a question that says, would you further discuss the line between manage retreat and hold the line for water dependent uses? So I think that question is probably more complicated than we have time for, and I really think that question gets at local priorities and how we kind of balance the needs and the approaches as we're thinking about planning and adaptation in California. So I'm not sure I can address that question right now, but what we tried to do in the guidance was provide a high-level framework from which to evaluate kind of your potential approaches and your pathways, and so that those decisions can be made at a local or regional level. Okay, let's see. I'm going to ask a question about whether the PowerPoint will be available. Sure, we're happy to post that on OPC's website. Okay, a question about once the guidance is adopted, will it be effective right away? And so, yes, the answer to that question is yes. And we tried to include some language in both the executive summary and the introduction that addresses the question of, well, what happens if you adopt this guidance in March and I'm already halfway through my planning process. And so OPC and the state acknowledge that a lot of work generally goes into the lead up to planning and implementation of projects and planning documents. And so we just encourage, if you haven't started your project, then you should definitely implement the new updated projections and guidance. If you are partially the way through or almost at the end of your planning process or into development, then think about those adaptation pathways and how you could transition over time to accommodate potential rises in sea level that weren't contemplated perhaps in the 2013 guidance.
This is Deborah. I just wanted to add on to that, Jen, that this is a guidance, right? It's not, these are not regulations. So this is a guidance document, and we have worked closely with our state partners over at Coastal Conservancy and Coastal Commission and State Lands Commission and OPR and all of the folks who are going to be providing more specifics on how local governments or applicants are going to need to take this up into their applications. But as it stands now, these are our suggestions, that they're not regulations.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. Okay, so this question says, how do we as a society make decisions for what gets to retreat, i.e. wetlands versus residential, that would both retreat to the same land area? That is a great question. And again, one I don't feel that I'm going to be able to provide a satisfactory answer. I think this is the challenge of our time, right? Is trying to understand what the impacts are kind of now and in the future, especially in the context of the uncertainty around sea level rise and the evolving nature of climate science. And so I think what we strive to do in this guidance is provide kind of structure and framework around the things that we need to be thinking about and considering. What is at risk? What is at stake? What are our priorities? And being sure that we can have a plan in place for making sure that those priorities are protected. And so I really do think that while the state, as Deborah just mentioned, can provide this statewide guidance level, high level overview and framework, there is a lot of work and tough decisions that were going to need to be made at the local and the community and the regional level. So the next question is, where can we view submitted comments on the guidance? We have not posted the comment letters themselves. We can talk internally about whether we can provide kind of a general overview of those, but we have not done that yet. Okay, so the next question is, will the guidance be substantively different document than the science report released in April 2017? It seemed like most of your feedback was about feedback on the science document. Can you provide more insight regarding what the guidance document will look like and what it will address? So I'm not sure who asked that question, but you can actually see our draft guidance document on Ocean Protection Council's website. So what it does is it takes the scientific foundation from the Rising Seas report, along with all of the input that we received from local, state, regional, and federal partners, and integrates that in a way to provide guidance and recommendations that are based on the best available science to ensure that we are prepared and can adapt to sea level rise. So the final draft is not going to be significantly different than kind of the structure that you see in the existing draft online. And the summary that I provided of the revisions, those are really kind of the high level themes that will change between the draft and the final. Okay, we are receiving a lot of questions about how the new projections relate to the previous NRC projections. Are there any fact sheets or summaries available that compare the old and new? Sorry, I'm scrolling through. Of particular interest is if probabilities can be assigned to the previous NRC numbers so we can make apples to apples comparisons between the old and new. So the short answer is no, we have not provided any fact sheets. And what we have been clear about kind of since this new revised science report came out is that we can't really make an apples to apples comparison between the NRC projections, which were scenario-based, and the probabilistic projections on which the April 2017 Rising Seas report highlights. So what we've tried to do, or what we have done, is provided all of the probabilistic projections for those 12 tide gauges, along with the H++ scenario in table format, along with guidance that directs users to evaluate a range of potential sea level rise heights depending on your project lifespan and the things that could potentially be at risk if you underestimate sea level rise, and then use that information to help guide what projections you will select. How will comments after March 2nd be incorporated into the document prior to March 14th, and when will that version be released? Okay, so the March 2nd, the final draft of the guidance document will be published on OPC's website. And that is consistent with publishing materials 10 days prior to an OPC meeting. And we will receive those comments as we receive comments on any OPC meeting materials. And but at that point, the guidance document will be close to final. Okay, will any consideration be given to elevate guidance for low-lying coastal, estuarine, or floodplain located landfills that may be impacted by climate change? So we tried to draw attention to this issue kind of in the recommendation and context around social equity and vulnerable communities as it relates to toxic sites and making sure that we're planning to address sea level rise in those areas. So I think this question is a really good suggestion for next steps and thinking about all of the types of issues that we kind of need to have in focus as we start thinking about implementation. So I'm just going to add that to my list. Okay. Are there plans for future review and revision after adoption in March? Yes. So, and this is explicitly called out in, I think, the executive summary and in the intro to the guidance document, that we will, at the very least, update the guidance every 5 years, if not sooner, particularly given the rapid nature of the advancing of the sea level rise science. And one of the benefits that our scientific working group had acknowledged when using probabilistic projections is that those projections are easily updated with new lines of evidence and scientific information. So they were intentionally selected so that we can have the flexibility to update the science more frequently if and when necessary. Okay, looking at next steps beyond this report, the Coastal Commission has got new residential adaptation guidelines, and BCDC is reevaluating its fill policies. As the cabinet level coastal management agency, is the OPC evaluating the feasibility of acquisition programs to assist homeowners? No, not at this time. But we are working really closely with our coastal management agency partners and are particularly focused on thinking about mechanisms for adaptation financing. And so this is something that can be integrated into that conversation. Can you talk more about what the guidance document will include? Missed what you said about partnership. Missed what you said about partnership with the budget office and identification of potential projects for funding. So I think what this person is asking about is the Governor's Office of Planning and Research and their adaptation clearinghouse. So OPR was required by legislation to establish the Integrated Regional Adaptation Climate Resiliency and Adaptation Program, and I just destroyed that acronym, but it's called ICARP, and they are required to help local governments coordinate with state agencies and integrate climate change into their planning. And as part of that effort, they are required to establish a state adaptation clearinghouse. And that clearinghouse is going to have landing pages that address a range of climate change impacts from sea level rise to wildfire and drought. And we have been working very closely with staff from OPR to kind of leverage our need to provide sea level rise resources as part of this guidance document release. And so we are going to kind of be part of the beta launch of the clearinghouse. And that website will host a breadth of different types of resources, ranging from examples of vulnerability assessments, funding opportunities, case studies, links to other planning documents, and other climate adaptation efforts around sea level rise happening locally and across the state. So it's really supposed to serve as a one-stop shop for all of the resources that will help folks plan for sea level rise. Okay, this question says, can you please elaborate on how you envision expanding the guidance to address public trust and water dependent uses? So as I said earlier in the presentation, we actually included an explicit recommendation just acknowledging the fact that water dependent uses and ports and public trust uses may have unique characteristics and constraints, and that may require different adaptation strategies and approaches than other places along the coast, right? So there may be places where managed retreat or natural infrastructure is not feasible. And so we wanted to explicitly acknowledge that in the guidance because it was something that we had not done in the original draft. Okay, so this question is about hold on one second. How does the guidance address local planning efforts already underway that rely on previous guidance? So I think I addressed this question earlier, that if folks are at the very early stages, initial stages of planning, that they should adopt the recommendations and projections in this updated guidance once it's adopted. If planning processes are underway, users should consider how they can either adapt their project or develop adaptation pathways to allow for projects to accommodate or adapt to rising sea levels that may be higher than what was originally anticipated in the NRC report. Has there been any discussion on updates to CEQA? I'm not exactly sure what that question is getting at. So I'm going to pass, and maybe that person could write back in and explain a little bit further.
This is Deborah. I do want to just note that that there has been a CEQA update that was just released, I believe, last week by OPR So, and I believe that it addresses some of the issues related to sea level rise, so you might want to check that CEQA update too.
Thank you. Okay, so this next question is, please elaborate on next step strategies for securing more funding to implement adaptation strategies at a local level. So Deborah, I don't know if you want to take this one or...
Sure. So there are a lot of funding strategies that are kind of circulating right now. And in fact, I was just at a convening that was hosted by OPR and the Federal Reserve a week ago with different folks talking about funding mechanisms that could be made available to local governments to actually implement adaptation strategies. I think the realization is dawning that local governments have done a really good job in a lot of cases of planning for adaptation and now need funding to actually implement those strategies. So one of the things that OPC is looking at is whether we could create some sort of pilot demonstration project to create a revolving loan fund to help fund some of those strategies, working with a variety of partners, whether they're CDFIs or philanthropic organizations, to create a fund that then local governments could apply for, and then as they can repay the loans, it would be structured kind of like a PRI or a program-related investment. So low interest rates, a friendly term to pay back the loan from, but have it be a loan rather than a grant. And the reason that we're looking at this kind of pilot project rather than a grant system is over time, the cost of adaptation implementation is going to be probably in the trillions of dollars across the state, and we simply just can't grant our way out of that. So we're looking at different opportunities for partnering with our local governments. So that's one of the things that's kind of floating out there. We're thinking about it would be a pretty small pilot project to start with, and hopefully it could grow both financially and geographically. But I would also encourage you to look at some of the things that some of the other CDFIs are doing out there, because they have a lot of innovative partnerships and projects.
Thank you, Deborah. Okay, let's see what else we have here. Okay. All right, I lost my, okay, once adopted.
Oh, I think,
yeah.
Did you get the, can you add more detail as to how the report is addressing the social equity piece, and what resources or methodology did you use to talk about this issue?
Thank you. So we received several comment letters. We actually, in addition to getting comments on the draft, had solicited feedback from folks who are kind of experts in this space to draft the original language, and then we got some great additional feedback from folks from Cause and others. So we really pulled out and expanded the social equity environmental justice piece. And I think I highlighted those places where we strengthened it. So again, greater emphasis on importance of early engagement with vulnerable communities and integrating them into planning from the very beginning, rather than checking in at the very end once their vulnerabilities have already been characterized and their priorities identified by folks who were not part of the initial discussion. The need to focus on kind of the disproportionate impacts that climate change is already having on vulnerable communities, and that sea level rise will continue to have, especially around kind of those communities being located close to toxic sites, having their access potentially to or along the beach cut off as sea level rise heightens. The idea that important and worthwhile to think about managed retreat and natural infrastructure, but at the same time keeping in mind that in places where we transition to those types of uses, there may be economic impacts, not only on job availability, but also affordability of homes. So really keeping that in focus. And again, thinking about the potential impacts of sea level rise and saltwater intrusion on the agricultural industry and the livelihoods that supports. So that was the social. Yep, go ahead.
This is Jen Phillips. I just wanted to chime in quickly. When thinking about this equity piece, we looked a lot at the Climate Justice Working Group findings and recommendations that were released this past summer, as well as the safeguarding plan for California, this California adaptation plan.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Okay, so this says, sorry, I have like a teeny window from which to read these questions.
I think the next question is, maybe I missed this, but is there a new draft report that shows the new changes you mentioned? It's not clear to me on the website.
Yeah, so yeah, Deborah, maybe I'll have you read the questions for me.
Sure. Yep.
So again, we have a draft that was released on November 15th. We had public comment available till December 15th. The revisions that I just walked everyone through, those will be reflected in the final guidance document that will be released for public review and comment on March 2nd.
All right, the next question is, once adopted, what are you recommending as to how other state agencies and local governments would best use the guidelines? Will other state agencies be asked to adopt the projections in their future planning processes?
Yeah, so as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we have been working really closely with our coastal management agency partners and the other agencies that participate in the Coast and Ocean Working Group of the Climate Action Team. And so far, all of our agency partners have communicated that they will be integrating these updated projections into their guidance and their planning processes. And so one of the things that we have kind of on our list of next steps is to continue that coordination to ensure that as the new projections are integrated, that everybody is on the same page and communicating in the same way, so that there's not confusion as these projections and recommendations kind of trickle down to local government decision making.
So the next question is, if the local tidal gauge is in an urbanized area, such as a city harbor, is that tidal information acceptable to use for rural coastlines within that county?
So I'm wondering if, I guess I'm curious where that is along the coast. But regardless, I think it's really important to point out that because we don't have tide gauges along every inch of California's coast, we are really using those 12 tide gauges as kind of a proxy for helping understand, to the best of our ability, kind of the local variation across the coast, right? So those 12 tide gauges are not going to be able to account for specific local variation everywhere. However, they do provide data-driven projections, and that's the most scientifically rigorous approach to being able to estimate localized sea level rise. And we point out in the updated guidance that if there's additional scientific data that's available, it may be used and evaluated in considering local planning decisions. So we're really in this guidance, again, trying to orient users to where they are on the coast and provide kind of real-time, on-the-ground tidal information, with the understanding that there may be more current or more detailed local specific data that could inform local decisions.
The next question is from the Port of San Diego. Will OPC post or make the public comments received so far available?
Yeah, so I think I addressed this comment a little bit earlier that we haven't posted all of the comments yet, but we can talk internally about the best way to provide a summary of those to the public.
All right, since we are often talking about the marine-urban interface, how much are planners involved and mechanisms, i.e. general plans for mitigation versus other mechanisms such as Coastal Conservancy?
I'm not sure I can answer that question. Hold on, I'm looking at this. How much are planners involved? I mean, I guess I can take a stab and say that, you know, none of us are doing sea level rise planning in a bubble, right? And so we've got kind of OPC taking the statewide approach and vision for how we think about being prepared for sea level rise, but that we've got partner agencies with differing mandates and requirements for helping manage development or assets along the coast. And then you've got local planners or local governments or community groups who are kind of on the ground doing that planning. So I think the answer is everybody needs to be involved and coordinated, and we see that kind of bolstering that coordinated effort as a really critical next step after this guidance is adopted.
The next question is, will additional public comment be possible between the release on March 2nd and the March 14th adoption?
Yeah, so there will be an opportunity to submit written comments as we accept written comments on all meeting materials 10 days prior to the meeting taking place. So again, the document will be posted on March 2nd, and you can provide public comments close up until the meeting on March 14th. We haven't set the public comment deadline yet.
Can you explain the, quote, risk aversion decision-making framework further with respect to sea level rise projections?
Yeah, so what we were intending to do there was the Rising Seas report did a really good job at just presenting the state of the science, right? That we have a way to understand the potential likelihood of a range of different sea level rise heights, as well as trying to consider the potential of this extreme H++ scenario. But the the Rising Seas report didn't take that farther to help people understand where in that table of numbers you should really be focusing your attention. So what we were trying to do is to help make sense of those tables and to direct folks to say, okay, if you have a project such as an unpaved coastal trail where you feel comfortable that that trail is going to flood, 5 times a year, then maybe you are okay planning for a lower level of sea level rise because you have a lower risk aversion, right? And so we have directed you to a certain set of numbers in that case. We do provide guidance for kind of the medium high risk aversion and the extreme risk aversion because we are trying to provide a spectrum of potential sea level rise and associated impacts so that users can evaluate what those impacts are going to look like in the near term and in the long term, and that they can understand their risk tolerance or aversion and then plan accordingly. So we were really trying to take that next step to, number one, ensure that users don't just default to the lowest possible projection because that does not serve anyone across the state or make us precautionary in any way. and two, to really make sure that we're providing kind of a spectrum or a framework in which to analyze the potential outcomes of sea level rise futures, understanding that there's quite a bit of uncertainty.
Thanks, Jen. Okay, the next question is, will grants that OPC is sponsoring, e.g. coastal resilience related, want to see reference to this document?
Yes, I mean, I don't think that that's going to be a requirement of grant funding, but I think we will want to see everyone being thoughtful about how they take this guidance and implement it in a way that will ensure that we're prepared for sea level rise.
The first draft recommends which sea level rise projections in Table 1 to use for low, medium, and high risk aversion projects. These numbers are boxed in red. Has anything about these recommendations changed?
No.
Oh, that was a quick answer. Okay, let me get to the next question. Isn't it the case that sea level rise projections, such as in this guidance, will update again and again and again, so anyone planning any adaptation project simply needs to acknowledge the issue of adaptability of the adaptations? There is no end point.
I think that is an excellent point, and really the catalyst for why we have been very focused on increasing the emphasis on the use of adaptation pathways. And so, yes, this is a moving target. The science will continue to update. We will get a better sense on kind of the probabilities, particularly as we have a better understanding of kind of the modeling around the impacts from the melt from the polar ice sheets. And so we felt that it was important to direct folks to analyze specific numbers, but also to be very clear and focused on the fact that we need adaptation pathways to help us be able to plan for this uncertainty and this variability, and the fact that things will continue to evolve in the future. And the only way that we are going to be prepared is if we've got kind of a range of pathways to adapt to varying scenarios.
Are those who are subject to AB 691, who have already put substantial effort into their plans, but who are more than 6 months away from submitting those plans, expected to convert over to using this new guidance as best available science?
Yeah, so I think that gets at a couple of the earlier questions about the state's expectation that we don't expect that everybody's going to stop what they're doing mid-plan and start from scratch, right? But we do hope and recommend that even if you have a planning process underway, that you think about how you can integrate these updated projections and what these potential increases in sea level rise mean for the planning processes that you have underway, and think about whether there are appropriate adaptation pathways to help kind of transition from the current thinking in your, partially developed plan and into the future.
As the new guidelines are being implemented later this year, does OPC plan more training and/or outreach in Southern California?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think one that we really would love to turn back onto the participants of this webinar. We're really seeking to solicit suggestions and feedback on what next steps are needed kind of at a local level or regional level to help support implementation of this guidance, right? So certainly we can think about an additional series of workshops and or webinars, but are there other tools or trainings that are necessary? Not that I won't promise that OPC will be able to deliver on all of them, but we're definitely wanting to pull together that list of next steps so that we can coordinate with our partners to make sure that that we can be as helpful as possible. And I would just recommend, it may be hard to provide those that feedback here, since we can't actually talk to one another, but we welcome emails, and we can get my contact information to everyone after the call.
Will there be provisions in the building code for sea level rise?
Again, I think that's something that is currently being considered through the working group of Assembly Bill 2800. So I think that is one of their main focus is to think about how to integrate kind of design criteria into building codes and other things, not just for sea level rise, but for all of the other climate change related impacts that we're going to see throughout the state.
To what degree does the updated guidance address the impacts of vertical land motion?
So the reason why we had included the projections for the 12 tide gauges was to acknowledge the difference in vertical land motion between the northern part of the state and the southern part of the state. So we are doing that. We're using those tide gauges to address that issue. We also include some language, I believe, in the recommendations that direct users to think about, local shoreline conditions. In addition to vertical land motion, you're going to have, different rates of erosion, cliff erosion, and beach erosion. And so all of those local factors really need to come into play when you're thinking about how you're going to plan for sea level rise in your community.
All right, and I think I can't tell how many more questions we have because, again, it's a teeny little box, but I think in the interest of time, this will be the last question. So it says, it sounds like you had some conflicting comments about the H++ projections. Is that staying in the guidance? What did you do to incorporate comments?
Yes, so the H++ scenario is staying in the guidance. And the concerns that we heard were that there was just either too much uncertainty around that scenario to be included in planning, or that it was just too difficult for folks planning in the near term to think about that amount of sea level rise. And we here at OPC and the state feel very, very strongly that while there is some uncertainty about when that level of sea level rise could happen, that it is critically important that we keep that potential in focus and that we consider it in planning. It doesn't mean that we need to construct every building or every wetland to withstand 10 feet of sea level rise, but again, building on this idea of adaptation pathways, we need to be thinking about how to handle that amount of sea level rise should it occur. So that will be remaining in the guidance.
And it is exactly noon now. So this is Deborah, and thank you, Jen, so much for fielding all of those questions. I found it fantastic. And again, if anyone has additional questions, you can always contact us. I don't know if, Jen, you wanted to give your contact information or just email the group afterwards.
Yeah. Mary or Carrie, is it possible to just send a follow-up email to the participants with my contact information?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, I want to say on behalf of OPC, thank you so much to everyone who joined us today. Please send any follow-up questions to us. I'm going to see if I can get all the list of questions from the Conservancy to make sure we didn't miss anything. And another thanks to the Coastal Conservancy and the Resiliency Network for helping host this webinar for us. Thank you, everyone.